I'm also really pleased that Barbara Perry has agreed to kick us off with her comments. And I'll say part of the reason I think Barbara is so important from my perspective is she was one of the first academics that I heard who really named white supremacy and right-wing extremism as a major threat to security in Canada at a time when people were looking elsewhere. And we'll talk more about that inclination to point our fingers elsewhere rather than looking deep within Canada and its history of genocide, discrimination, and hate. So Barbara is a professor at the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University, where she's also the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. And she holds a UNESCO chair in hate studies. She's written extensively on social justice generally, hate crimes and right-wing extremism specifically, and she has published several books spanning each of these areas. I will then, after Barbara speaks, I'll introduce our panelists. I also did want to say that for many of us on this call, these issues are deeply personal, and some of the discussions could be triggering or very upsetting. So please all take care of yourselves. And if you find it too difficult to participate or to watch today, we will have transcripts, we will have copies of the program. So over to you, Barbara.
Great. Good, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And also thank you for the invitation to participate today and to sort of kick things off. You say, you know, that it's personal for us. And I think, you know, I share that sentiment, although oddly enough, given the work that I do in this space, and the names that I name, I you know, touch wood, haven't been targeted as yet, but it still remains deeply personal to me because of the consequences that far-right extremism, hate, and its many manifestations has for our sort of collective sense of belonging and the sense of safety and security for so many of the people that we love and work with and respect. So, and I just thank you for putting this conference together as well. I think some really important conversations to be had over the course of the day. And I think it's really interesting that we are, where is, there we go. No. I'm trying to share here and it's not cooperating.
James, can you assist?
It's just it's showing Microsoft PowerPoint, but there's a yield sign with a question mark there.
If you quickly email your presentation to me, I can get it to the team and hopefully someone
I'll
can.
send you the link. I know from long experience that it's generally too big to email, so I will definitely send that.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so I mean, I always like to start this conversation by talking about the context, because I think it's really important that we acknowledge that obviously these many manifestations of hate that we see, whether it's online, offline, whether it's hate crime, whether it's far right extremism, you know, doesn't emerge in a vacuum. That there is, you know, what I've long called an enabling climate or an environment of hate that allows for the flourishing of these sorts of patterns. And you know, I think there's a whole constellation of factors that we could draw attention to, and I just want to highlight just a handful. And I think first is the political context, obviously, and I talk about, you know, Trumpism and Trump 1.0 and now 2.0 as well. You know, we really like to lay the blame for the problems we're seeing even in Canada at the feet of Trump, beginning with his campaign for the leadership of the Republican Party, obviously in 2015, where he began this trajectory, long trajectory of you know, vilifying and demonizing a whole array of communities with very explicit language, very blatant language. about the the evils associated with immigrants generally, with Muslims, with Latinos, with Black people, with members of the queer community as well. And that just sort of was exaggerated over time, and not just in terms of discourse and narratives, but obviously also in terms of policy. If you think about the ban on entry from of people from Muslim majority countries, that's a concrete, not just an ideological, but a material consequence of his foundational notions of belonging and place, and who was a true American, the whole MAGA deal, if you will. And of course that did very much bubble up into Canada, and had fertile ground here as well. We look at public opinion polling, for example, even before 2015, 2016, where we see relatively high rates of distrust of some faith communities, some racial communities, for example. But also in very similar political rhetoric, during the election where the Liberals won the first recent administration, the outgoing Conservative administration, was playing to Islamophobia in particular, and anti-immigrant sentiment like I think we had never seen. And of course, it's just gotten worse over time, both at the federal level and at the provincial levels as well. And I think two of the other dynamics are, sort of a collective dynamic here that we've seen since 2020 in particular is backlash violence and backlash narratives against communities like Black communities and Indigenous communities that have engaged in a real assertion of rights and in ongoing protest and demonstration against the murders of Black men by police, against sort of the history of oppression and violence against the Indigenous community, especially around the discovery of the children's bodies at residential schools. So we've seen in response to that attempts by the right and conservatives in particular, a response intended to put them back in their place, right, to silence them once again. So that's become very much a part of a resurgent part of the far right. And of course, COVID and the convoys, both of them provided platforms and magnets really for the expansion, very much the expansion of anti-Semitic narratives, anti-Asian narratives, and in particular anti-authority narratives, which is something that has really come to the fore, unlike I think in any other period of history in the Canadian context. There we go. Is that showing, or is that me? No, that's probably me.
Barbara.
So those are some of the flashpoints I think that have shaped the environment that we're playing in. Yeah, so that's sort of part of the context. Again, there's much more to it than that. The other thing I want to point to is sort of the rise of the right in the online and offline spaces, both is concomitant with the rise in hate crime generally. So we've seen the first uptick was from 2016 to 2017, a dramatic increase of 47% in police reported hate crimes, which is just an unheard of jump in any category of crime. If we'd seen that anywhere else, there would have been a call for a national inquiry, would have been very much up in arms about that sort of increase, but it was actually met with silence. And we continue to see an uptick as well, so that, for example, just since 2019 to 2021, the latest set of data available, we've seen over 70% increase in hate crime in that very short period of time. And again, increased violence against Black and Indigenous communities, against Asian communities, Jewish communities, and Muslim communities as well. So sort of the usual targets in some respect. And, you know, some proportion of those are committed by folks very much affiliated with the far right, and some who are unaffiliated, but nonetheless share some of those same sentiments and hostilities towards other communities. One of the things that we've been developing as we do this work around right-wing extremism is a typology of sort of what we're calling the idiosphere, because it's not just group-based. So we can't just talk about white supremacist groups any longer or anti-authority groups any longer. Yeah, they're still out there. They're still very much, you know, an important part of the movement, but the movement has also become much more atomized and diffuse. So that there is, you know, a fragmentation of ideologies. So when we published our first study of the far right in 2015, we, you know, really what we were seeing there were some very traditional elements. So white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and skinheads. And now our idiosphere, I hope we can get this up so that you can see. I think we've got now about 12 different categories, different classes, if you will. So it's sort of expanded, if you will, to include, you know, very discrete threads around, as I said, the anti-authority movement, a resurgence of Christian fundamentalism, which is unusual for the Canadian context. The alt-right, we were sort of, you know, seeing immediately after the Trump election. It's starting to fade out a little bit now, but specific threads and pillars around anti-Semitism, around Islamophobia, militia and patriot movement is something that has emerged, and the accelerationist movement, which, you know, you probably recall hearing much about during the convoys around Diagolon, which was, you know, sort of a Canadian-born element of the far-right movement. So accelerationist movements, their intent is to, as it says on the tin, to accelerate the coming of what they see as the necessary and inevitable civil war. They understand the current government and current order to be wholly corrupt and illegitimate, and so applaud anything and support anything that looks as if it's about to rend that asunder. So the events of January 6th in the US, for example, the insurrection was thought to be the beginning of the American Civil War, the next American Civil War. Even the convoy was claimed by some to be our own, you know, January 6th, the beginning of our own Civil War. And so for some, it is this all-out civil war, just this attempt to overturn the state, the political order. For others, it harks back to the more traditional white supremacist Rahowa, or racial holy war. I think that's something that we don't hear quite so much about, but there still are, you know, some virulently white supremacist groups that would still very much applaud that in particular, that very specifically. What else can I mention here? One of the pieces that I think is often forgotten when we talk about the far right or white supremacists is sort of what we are now classing as sort of gender defender ideologies. It's, you know, it's much broader than the incel. It's much broader than misogyny, but includes, as we've seen so much of in the last year or so, in particular, you know, anti-queer politics, anti-trans politics. So much evidence of that at the political and popular level alike. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves that at the core of much white supremacist and far right narratives is this notion of you know, gender propriety. So if you think about one of the core mottos of the far right, it's the 14 words, we must secure the existence of the white race and a future for our children. So if we're going to secure the future of the white race, it means we need to control our women and control their sexuality, control their relationships, so that, you know, miscegenation or, you know, relationships with non-white men or with women, other women, are all problematic and to be punished, if you will. So important to keep that line that piece in mind. I think the other thing I'll touch on just here is the notion of what's been called lone actors or lone wolves. And I sort of want to challenge that that label, that kind of title that's been applied to those individuals who are acting alone. So we're down to 4 there. Thanks so much, Wendy. So I prefer a term, something like, networked individuals or something, because yes, so here you see the lone actors at the top. Yes, they are, engaging in the violence. They engage in, back up one. As an individual, there's no conspiracy. They're not working in conjunction with another or other actors. But nonetheless, they're not acting independently. They're very much a part of the milieu, especially the online milieu. That is, they're very actively consuming and often producing hateful narratives in the online space. So they are, again, not necessarily lone actors in the most pure notion of that term. So again, now you can see it. So it's getting messier and messier and sort of fuller and fuller as we go along. We can go to the next slide, please, Wendy. Okay, so this is the distribution that we're seeing in terms of group activity associated with the far right, and this is a fairly consistent distribution where Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta tend to lead the field, if you will, in terms of the number of active groups. And so this is, the numbers are up dramatically from the 2015 report, but the distribution has remained very much the same. Next slide. Other direction. There we go. And it's also the case that, not surprisingly, that the kinds of incidents that we see, the far right incidents of violence and other activities, also correspond to that same distribution, same concentration, if you will. Next slide, please. And this is the kind of activity that we're seeing. And again, this is a 5-year period of time that we're scoping here compared to the first study. Because it was the first national study of right-wing extremism, we took a long view. So we were looking from 1985 up to 2021. So a 30-year period of time, and only identified through open source just over 100, I think 120 incidents. In a 5-year period of time, we identified over 600, almost 700 incidents. Now, a very large proportion of them obviously were what were typically relatively peaceful protests and rallies, but still, we have well over 200, closer to 300 incidents of criminal activity, including some pretty horrific violence associated with the far right as well. So much more active, even in terms of the absolute number of groups. We have identified, closer to 300 active groups over the last couple of years, compared to just about 100 groups during the last study. Next slide, please. And I think this is the most extreme, and this really, I think, puts in perspective the real risk, the real harms associated with the far right. And this is accounting only for mass and multiple murders associated with the far right. There have been an additional, I think, 3 now, individual homicides. But moving from the top, 2014, 3 RCMP officers killed by someone who held, very right-wing, anti-authority, and obviously anti-police sentiments. 2017, of course, 6 men murdered at the mosque in St. Croix, Quebec, by someone very much influenced by Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and other far-right leaders. Then 2018, of course, the incel activist who killed immediately 10 victims. The 11th succumbed to their injuries just last year, so I include that there. And again, in 2021, another Islamophobic murder in London. And then 2022, this is something that I think isn't on the radar of a number of people. And this is, and there's, 4 charges, homicide charges being laid, but there's a fear that in fact there might be more. And this was an individual who killed, again, at least 4 Indigenous women, but was affiliated with a really virulent white supremacist group called Holy Europe. So, unprecedented. This is a higher number of murders associated with the far right than any other extremist element in, I would say, probably historically in Canada. Okay, next. So I've alluded to some of these trends. I won't revisit them, of course, a growth in numbers. Also the atomization of the movement, as I was saying, groups are, continue to be a significant element of the movement, but we're seeing more and more people like those networked individuals being drawn into the movement, especially in the online space, but not necessarily affiliating with a particular group. So they are adopting some of those ideological threads that were featured in that typology, and weaving them together into their own narrative. So they're consuming those discourses online, and often then feeding back and producing their own materials, producing their own narratives or stories to suit their own needs and experiences, if you will. We've also seen really incredible demographic shifts over the past few years. In that, when we think about the skinheads and the neo-Nazis in particular, I think we have this image of disenfranchised youth, and that was for in large part the case. So 18 to 24, just as with most crime, most folks would age out of the movement in their mid-20s or late 20s, unless they held a leadership position, in which case they might stay in longer just for the status that it provided them. But we've seen now an aging demographic or an older demographic, so people coming to the movement who are middle-aged or older. So those right-wing elements that are associated with the convoys, very good example of that. And they're often educated, college, university degrees, so not disenfranchised. They're often well employed as well. Look at the events of January 6th in the US. Lawyers and accountants and doctors and police officers and military personnel, all very much part of the status quo, but nonetheless being drawn in, often through the conspiracy theories that we've seen circulating more recently. We're seeing more coalition building amongst the far right as well. So in that first study, there was a lot of infighting within and between groups, for the right or the power to define the movement. What was too extreme, what wasn't extreme enough. So a lot of challenges in terms of the stability of the groups. Now we're seeing much more coalition building, and again, I think the convoys were a really clear example of that. Where we had multiple groups and multiple ideologies and multiple conspiracy theories, sort of pulling people together around, a shared enemy, if you will, or a shared foe or grievance. And then the last trend that is especially concerning is a growing guns rights narratives, almost American style. So even at the convoys, we were hearing references to the Second Amendment, wrong Constitution, folks, but nonetheless, that didn't stop them. So we're seeing, even with the now, well, I think re-envisioned Proud Boys, one of their mottos was, "We love our guns." So we would see images of groups engaged in paramilitary training out in the woods with stockpiles of heavy weaponry, military style assault weapons, that sort of thing. So we've got, and then you add to that the fact that there is a explicit recruitment of people with military and law enforcement backgrounds. We've got now the skills that they're presumed to bring in terms of strategic planning, in terms of discipline, all of that. So the skill and the arms, right, and the knowledge of how to use them now, and then these xenophobic or misogynistic or whatever ideologies might be informing them. So I think that's a really dangerous combination. Next slide, please. Next slide. I'm just going to just speak briefly about this. We can run through the slides pretty quickly here. I think I just wanted to introduce some comments about recruitment, because I think there's where we tend to think that all of the recruitment is happening online now. Next slide, please. I think it's important to recognize that actually we're seeing, you can go to the next slide, that we're actually seeing it in multiple spaces, in traditional and new sort of modern technological ways. So immediately after the Trump election, we started to see in communities large and small across the country, these very traditional ways of calls to arms, if you will, ways of bringing people into the movement, posters and flyers and leaflets, things that were being posted on hydro poles or utility poles or under windshield wipers or in people's mailboxes, that sort of thing. And often, so this one just says join the alt-right, but often there was a website provided on the posters as well, so that people would know, how to engage. So we still see that those very traditional forms. Next slide, please. Including face-to-face recruitment of friends and peers and sometimes relatives as well through house parties, the concerts. Now they're back up and running again after COVID. Mixed martial arts, or now what they're calling active clubs, has become a really important venue for bringing people in. And you can imagine, with this look here, never mind all the horrific tattoos, but just this macho stance. And how that the hypermasculinity of MMA sort of coincides with the hypermasculinity of the far right movement as well. So it's almost a natural connection there. So it's become a really important point. As I said, peer-to-peer, a lot of recruitment on college and university campuses now, often starting with those kinds of groups that refer to themselves as free speech groups. Resisting what they refer to, of course, as the cancel culture or the woke culture. So that's something I think we need to be very much aware of on campuses. Next. And then, of course, we do have the online recruitment, and it's, recruitment, regardless of where it occurs, is actually a slow process. It's not linear, a few steps forward, some steps back. And all sorts of forums in which this can happen. But I think what I really want to focus on, I think because it's become so important, is the gaming culture. And some of the games themselves are bad enough. So there's a game called Ethnic Cleansing that's been around since probably the 90s. And as the name suggests, it is a horrifically racist, often misogynistic and anti-authority video game where you get more points for killing people of color or Jews or police officers, for example. So some of the games themselves are problematic enough. But what has become really challenging now are the ancillaries. The chat rooms that are associated with these games. So these become sites for grooming, if you will, leading people down the garden path towards the far right. So engaging them in conversation. Well, I see that you're going after, this particular category of people, and let's talk a little bit about that. You seem to, have a problem with the women in the game. Do you have a girlfriend? Do you have how do you get along with your mom? And then just leading them into darker and darker spaces and games and websites and conversations. So it really is a growing process, and mostly for youth, but we also see adults vulnerable to this as well. So again, something to look out for. And I think that go to the next slide, because I think that was it for me. I might have gone a little over, and I apologize for that. But again, I really appreciate the opportunity to share our observations and our discoveries with you all. So yeah, happy to take some questions now if anyone has something that they would like to pose. And I see we do have some questions. So, shall I go ahead and answer the questions in turn, or do you want to moderate them? How will we?
Sir, Barbara, I think at this stage it might make sense to open it up to the panel, and then after the panel, we work through the panel. Then we'll have some time for questions at the end, because I think many of the themes that you so perfectly set up for us are issues that the other panelists will dig into more deeply. And thank you so very much for that. I mean, it's you have the research to really, I think, underscore what many of us have observed based on anecdote and experience. So if I may, I'd like to move on and invite the panelists to turn on their cameras. Barbara, please stay on as well. And we'll we have some questions and comments from them. So we'll start with Dr. Nadia Hasan, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the National Council of Canadian Muslims, which is a leading organization, she leads organizational development, program management, and national operations. She's worked in teaching, project management, and across the nonprofit sector. And she's also worked at various research institutions, and she's taught at post-secondary institutions. So welcome, Nadia. And then our next panelist is Dr. Amanda Dale, who's an international human rights scholar and activist with a specialization in access to justice and women's human rights. She's currently faculty at the Women's Human Rights Institute and a recognized spokesperson and expert in the way law impacts marginalized people's lives and women's rights and violence against women. And Amanda was instrumental with many of the interventions at the Mass Casualty Commission that recently occurred, which really made a lot of these connections, and Dr. Perry was there as well. And our third panelist is Dr. Pam Palmater, who's a Mi'kmaq lawyer and a member of the Eel River Bar First Nations in northern New Brunswick. She's a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University, and she's been researching and writing on issues impacting First Nations governance and anti-Indigenous racism for a number of years, and certainly has also highlighted many of the intersecting elements that Dr. Perry referenced. So I'm just going to open it up to the three of you, maybe starting with Nadia, to comment on Dr. Perry's presentation and the trends and dynamics that she's identified, and add any additional insights based on your own experience with your specific organizations and communities. So Nadia, could you kick us off, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks for the introduction. Dr. Perry, as you know, it's we use Dr. Perry's work all the time in our work at NCCM, but just by way of like a quick introduction of what NCCM does, NCCM is a nonprofit and a civil liberties human rights organization that works specifically on issues of Islamophobia and racism and hate in Canada. And our work is really grounded in the diverse array of Muslim communities in Canada. And we kind of do this work through various means, including public interest law, through government relations, public advocacy, through media, and through education. And our work at NCCM often brings us to the very front lines of hate and the kinds of hate crimes that you were talking about, Dr. Perry, and the kind of experiences of extreme and tragic violence that have taken lives of Muslims, and as many of you know, and Dr. Perry mentioned some of those incidents. But I wanted to kind of, if it's okay with you, like just ground my thoughts in one of the most harrowing stories of like extremism, of right-wing extremism and online hate that I've come across in my work at NCCM. And that was related to the incident in Quebec City. But it was like around late 2016, a Muslim child in Quebec City who was like so many kids that we know, was just scrolling through social media, and he came across something that he showed to his uncle. and it was a Facebook post. It was a post that was encouraging people in Quebec specifically to get what they were calling a license to hunt Muslims. And this was kind of gaining a lot of traction online. And folks in Quebec City were getting really worried about this hunting license to hunt Muslims in Quebec City that was spreading on Facebook, specifically in Quebec groups and channels. So this child's uncle got really worried. He was aware of like all the incidents that their local mosque had already faced related to Islamophobia. So he went to the police to raise his concerns. And the police, quite unsurprisingly, really couldn't do much about this very overt call to violence against a very specific group. It was just a few months after that we saw a man walk into the Quebec City Mosque and open fire on families that had gathered there for worship, killing 6 Muslims and injuring several others. And one of the survivors, who miraculously survived 7 bullets to his body from when he dove in front of Muslim children that the attacker was aiming his weapon at, continues to suffer in pain like nearly 6 years later, and has kind of continued to speak out about the issue of right-wing extremism through his work. When the attacker was being sentenced during this massacre, the judge noted that the police had found profuse amounts of right-wing extremist content on the attacker's computer. And this included a plethora of right-wing material related to Trump and the Trump inauguration. And the attack actually happened days after Trump's announcement of the Muslim ban. So there's like kind of really like an ecosystem. And I think Dr. Perry is right in pointing out that, we need to get out of thinking about just groups that are organized and identifiable that are doing this work. This same mosque that experienced this attack, a few months later had a severed pig's head left on their doorstep, like a bloody severed pig's head on their doorstep. The car of the president of the mosque was set on fire months after the attack at the mosque. Swastikas were painted on their walls, feces were smeared on their doors, and countless other experiences of hate have really characterized their experience as Muslims in Quebec City since the attack, like before the attack and since the attack. I want to quote from a letter that the president of the mosque actually had written to the Premier of Quebec after the Premier of Quebec had made very public statements about 1 year after this awful attack at the Quebec mosque, denying the existence of Islamophobia. And the president of the mosque was imploring and like nearly begging the premier in this letter to acknowledge that Islamophobia exists in this province, and beyond this attack that took 6 lives and ruined several others, that there are many, many reasons, and he lists them all in his letter in detail. But one of the things he said really struck me, and I'll just quote from his letter really briefly. He said that there is danger in the house, Mr. Premier, a danger that obliterates memory, that reinforces extremism and unties forked tongues. And I bring up this story to really ground my thoughts in the complex realities of Islamophobic right-wing extremism and the way Muslim communities experience them. Unfortunately, we know that this story is not the only one of its kind, and the Muslim community is not the only one that has had these like really horrific experiences at the hands of right-wing extremism. But I wanted to show that even within the very specific experiences of right-wing extremism within a very specific locale of Quebec City, we can see how right-wing extremism traverses so many planes of existence. From an ordinary experience like a child scrolling on socials to extreme violence and death, to violence and gaslighting by the state. And at NCCM, the multifaceted and often amorphous and evolving nature of right-wing extremism has been one of the biggest challenges we are facing. And Dr. Perry can tell you how often we consult her to kind of continue to refine our understanding and try to advocate for things that will help change what we're facing, or to help to kind of address the threats, the very immediate and urgent threats that our communities are facing. And we've mobilized alongside other communities to have, for example, several white supremacist groups such as the 3%ers, the Proud Boys, Blood and Honor, Atomwaffen, and others listed as terrorist entities. And we're working very hard alongside so many others to find solutions to address the fact that our regulatory and justice systems are simply not equipped to deal with the phenomena of online hate. But, will these initiatives work? That really remains to be seen. This is such an experimental space for so many people. We're hopeful, but we know that, there is, as Dr. Perry mentioned, there is a steady rise in hate crimes. And, there are, as Dr. Perry said, usual targets that continue to be at the receiving end of that hate. But we know that these stats are alarming, and they're real, and they inform the way people go about their everyday lives, looking over their shoulder. And there's no doubt that we need to do more. So I'm really looking forward to kind of discussing with the rest of the panel of how we can, what it is that we need to do more. What are some, I really think there's a need for all of us to think creatively in really grounded ways, and all of the experiences the incredible panel is bringing to the table about what action we can take based on this very enriching research to deal with the phenomenon.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Nadia. I know that Amanda, you have to leave a little bit early, and we really appreciate you shoehorning us into your schedule. So I'm going to go to you next and give you a chance to speak, and then I know you may need to jump off, but we will have some time for Q&A. So please.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And I'm really struck by how grateful I am that you've organized, that the Diversity Institute has organized this discussion and this conference. It is such an important topic. It is so pressing and so difficult to have these conversations. And there are so few places where we're able to have them openly and speak about both the personal and the political impact on our communities and on our personal lives. So I really deeply appreciate that we're having this discussion. And I want to thank Barbara for really depressing me more than I already was with your fabulous numbers and statistics and the reality check that we all need about these linkages. I want to situate myself a little bit in this discussion, both personally and then in terms of my work. And as you were talking, Nadia, I just had this really strong urge to quote Martin Niemöller's line, which of course comes from, the experience of the Holocaust in Europe, and is a phenomena and a political event and a genocidal event that I studied a great deal in my previous life. And so this line really came to me, that here we are together with these disparate experiences of hate that Barbara's kind of grouped together for us in a way that we can understand. And the quote is, then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. And so it's that call to all of the identities that are maligned and grouped in this hateful way that we can experience separately, and we must come together to be able to combat, even if our separate threads need our full attention. And so today for me is so important for that. I guess I wear many hats in relation to today's topic. I think I was trying to figure out how I fit in when Wendy first asked me to speak. And I had to pull on all the threads to weave the picture of what it is I bring. I have a 40-year career as a leader in the gender-based violence service sector. And I spent 10 years as the executive director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic in Toronto, where I was part of leading test case litigation that drew the line on various forms of hate that specifically women in a variety of communities were experiencing, primarily Indigenous women, Muslim women, Black and racialized women, working class women, and sex workers. And I also drew a fair bit of online hate and direct physical hate and vandalism for my work, particularly on the case that I mounted on behalf of the clinic, pushing back on the destruction of the gun registry because of that link that Barbara has talked about between the amassing of guns, the use of guns, and misogynistic violence, as well as racist violence. I'm the chair of a board of directors of an organization called Inter Pares, which is a Canadian-based international human rights organization. And one of the big, strong threads in our work, I've been part of the board for 15 years, and we have been working on the rise of various fundamentalisms around the world and the human rights implications that our counterparts, our partners in human rights work in those spaces around the globe have been identifying for a very long time and often unrecognized ways. And I've been directly a part of the content of those discussions because of my work here in Canada. And I'm also a queer woman who has become increasingly alarmed and concerned and increasingly vocal on the issues of the rise of LGBTQI2S plus hate that we're seeing. And that hate, much like the period, the historic period I referred to in the quote at the beginning, that Weimar period in Germany, right before the rise of Nazism, there was an increase in a kind of cultural acceptance of all of the groups that wound up being genocidally attacked, but the legal frameworks were restricting them. And we're seeing some of those similar patterns in the incredible rise in hate-based forms of legal restriction on the basis of LGBTQI and especially trans folks around the world. And in fact, 67 countries have national laws criminalizing same-sex relations between consenting adults. And in addition, at least 9 countries have national laws that criminalize forms of gender expression and that target transgender and gender non-conforming people. The legal sanctions against same-sex conduct vary in scope and application. In some countries, we have gone as far as the death penalty, and you will have seen some of the material that's come out around the latest legislative framework in Uganda. This is linked very closely to the control of women's bodies, which Barbara, discussed in her research. And the climate, if anybody thought that the defeat of Roe versus Wade in the United States, which is, of course, the watershed and landmark abortion rights case in the US, if anybody thought that was disconnected from any of the rest of this, it is most certainly not. And it is the same forms and groups who have had this in their sights for many decades and have now got the success under their belts, who are in fact funding and fueling the legislative frameworks that we see appear in places like Uganda. The funding is very clear, very direct, and has been traced through research that is irrefutable. And the local activists are framing this very clearly as the current form of colonization. I also led a legal intervention to protect the right of a woman to wear her niqab in the preliminary hearing of a sexual assault trial, the trial of her cousin and her uncle for allegedly sexually assaulting her. And in that experience, I became aware of the degree to which the hatred that was directed against her, that was supported by state practices and by outdated legal standards of, that talked about what a reliable witness would be and do. I became really acutely aware also of the risks that those of us who defend, who are human rights defenders, the risks that we need to take and that we are taking, and that we are being exposed to the hate ourselves. And this is an important link, I think, to the global context that we work in, that human rights defenders are themselves worthy of an entire special procedure at the UN for the defense of human rights defenders. Because if we are not speaking up and we are silenced, then who is speaking up? And I think this is an important thing for us to recall, because we can be directly affected by these issues, but we are also talking about intersections with issues that don't directly affect us. And I think we need to really see ourselves in that global context of human rights defenders, because it is a global conversation. And it's an identity that I think we need to adopt a little bit more clearly here in Canada. It's an identity that is clear to folks in states that have eroded, in places where there are, civil wars. And we've seen with things like the convoy that we're not so stable as we think. So I'm, as you might have noticed, I'm an international human rights scholar who's interested in the ways that local and global interplay, the incongruity between norms and standards at the international level and the implementation of those standards in national contexts. Canada has historically tried to position itself as an exception to the global context, and is, of course, much better at those things than others, has often led important discussions at the international level for the raising of those standards, and yet does not live by them here in all spheres, and particularly in relation to the rights of Indigenous people and Indigenous women in particular. And I'm sure Dr. Palmater will be talking more about that context and that sort of smug ignorance of our own implication in the history of hate. I really felt this strongly when the convoy was in town, because I live in the Ottawa area. And when they were in town, the sense of sort of pearl clutching and hand wringing about how did all this happen and where did it come from? And, racialized groups, Black people, Indigenous people, people who've had their rights taken from them because of how they raised their children, or, their interaction with the criminal system, they were not surprised by these events. They were horrified and they were affected by them, but they weren't as surprised as the kind of, general public response to it. And I'm glad people were shocked, but I was also shocked they were shocked. And so this is, I think, what we're talking about, is that we need to normalize the discussion that this is not an exception, and that Canada has always sat on these issues. And I think we are trying to also talk about the online particularities of this. And I just want to say that, this is an area where the United Nations has really begun to kind of step up to the plate. And, the United Nations General Secretary has called social media a bullhorn for bile, which is kind of a catchy phrase with an alliteration to it. But I think it's really important to see that the office is making it a priority. and they've been unequivocal in their statements. They've talked about the online, violence is and disinformation in particular, which was a piece of what Barbara spoke about, but it is a very specific driver of the kinds of insurrections we're seeing from the right, and the kinds of protests we saw, like in the convoy. And he says it's fueling conflict and death and destruction now. I mean, these are strong words. You don't usually talk about, death and destruction from the UN unless you've got statistical information that there's actual causal links there, and that it's threatening democracy and human rights now. And it's undermining public health and climate action now. So I guess for me, in the face of the despair and what I called pearl clutching and hand wringing about, oh, whatever shall we do, there is some really tangible work ahead of us. And one of the things that I'm exploring at the moment, and I would love to, kind of have this discussion go further tomorrow when we talk more about solutions, is what role we can urge the Canadian state to play in relation to the global compact that is being discussed on limiting online hate and using a human rights framework as a pull in by states to regulate this space and to agree to some basic standards. And of course, they have a vested interest in this if they're being overthrown by, right-wing groups that are amassing online. It doesn't mean that they have the power and the resources to stop what's happening, or that the sort of economic engine of, what creates the most clicks and what creates the most, data for big companies to pool. These remain huge issues that underlie this discussion, but I think some regulation and in the form of a global compact starts to shift the conversation. And we've seen the EU already tackle this. The community services organizations, like the ones I've worked for in the past and that many of you are affiliated with or work with in your spare time, such as it is, they have been able to make a real difference in this conversation through their advocacy at the global level. And it's really a very small group of, rights-based, specifically gender-based organizations like Equality Now in the US that combine to create the Alliance for Digital Rights. And they've really driven this agenda at the UN level and have been successful in getting that attention. So I guess I was driven to say something slightly hopeful after this discussion that we've had so far, in the hopes that it will help us lead into tomorrow, that there are some, I think, tangible things we can use the power of Canada's state role in the global context to advance this agenda and assist all of us globally as human rights defenders in pushing back on this context that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Pamela, over to you.
Thanks so much, Wendy, for having me. I'm just so honored to be part of this panel of experts. And Wendy, of course, you're my mentor, friend, and hero. So I know you always bring these issues forward and we have to keep talking about it. And in fact, thanks to all the attendees for being intentional about attending and listening and understanding where we're going and what we can do about it, because we're all envisioning basic peace, social justice, human rights, and that's beyond religious lines, that's beyond political lines. We're just really getting at the basics of humanity, and that's what online hate really challenges, because it's far more visible. Like, you remember in the old days when there's all these little hate groups in their mom's basements and you rarely ever heard from them, and no one in the media would ever think of giving them a voice box or presenting them as some kind of balanced media. But now it's more visible. So I don't just blame social media. I also blame mainstream media because, you know, they're also online. And to basically pose or have this problematic ideology around balanced ideas, where you will have a lawyer who's an expert in human rights with the member of the Proud Boys. And that's somehow a balanced discussion. And that does a real disservice to Canadians, because those aren't the two choices: respect human rights and don't murder people, or hate all of these groups. Like, those aren't the options. But when it's presented that way, and you see this polarization of politics and even polarization within religious beliefs, you know, you have like the liberal version of a Christian and the center version, and now the like far right extremist version of a Christian, and it's really all getting messed up. And we're forgetting like the impact this is having on the next generation. Like, we have a huge problem now, but the next generation, our kids are tied to social media. Our kids get everything online. Even schools now spend a ton of money on technology. Kids in grade 1 are learning on iPads. So the implications for the future could potentially be even more devastating without social media education, without online education, without critical thinking, like the basics in critical thinking. I mean, this side of 50 years ago, you had to have facts and evidence, and, you know, you could argue and debate, but they had to be based on facts and evidence and proof. And now anything goes, even with leaders and politicians. Lies, allegations, innuendo, outright hate, doesn't matter. In fact, that's just going to trigger the algorithm and get more followers and make it look like you have more support. And there's social media farms who just pump this stuff out. So it's not even representative of the numbers of people, but it's all this facade, right? So social media, anything online, in fact, including mainstream media, can spread like a virus. And these are some of the interlocking things that we need to consider, because this whole idea of hate and the forms in which they're in, because we know there's individuals that are inspired by online hate. I hate the term lone wolf. I mean, I totally agree. That doesn't cover it. So someone might not be an official member of a hate group, but if they're online all the time and they're in these forums and they're engaging and they're inspired to commit an act of hate or violence, that's the same thing. We shouldn't be so focused on group so much as this online hate-osphere, manosphere, whatever you want to call it. And the fact that it's very much linked to our own state institutions. And that's where people get really uncomfortable. People don't want to talk about the RCMP and the numbers of people in the RCMP that are officially part of these hate groups, or have their own private forums where they essentially spew the same hatred, violence, misogyny against like women in particular, Indigenous peoples, or any law enforcement or the military. And the threat that poses to national security, in addition to public safety, when state institutions that are there to protect or serve Canadians hold these views, that can be the difference between someone getting shot or not. And that can be the difference between a law enforcement agency providing so-called freedom truckers and all the hate groups that are gathering, laying siege to Ottawa, with intel and strategy and things like that. That's literally the difference. And that's very close to the heart of, like, the Prime Minister, for example. What if it's your own detail that's involved in that? And I don't think we've thought about that enough, because what happens to us in society can't be just seen as an individual thing. Oh, well, that just happened to that female politician, that kind of thing. White hate groups has a huge crossover in state institutions, policing, military, but in a whole genre of things that present threats that we wouldn't necessarily think of. And it's a mistake to think of it as formal groups. I know we study like cells and groups and all, forums and things like that, but the online hate group is much bigger, and it's getting much worse, not even just because of hate groups. Think about what happens on Twitter. Some user 1234 says something horrifically racist or misogynistic. People with good intentions retweet that and say, isn't this a horrible thing to say? Now you've given all of your followers to that user 1234 who only had 2 followers. They get access to that whole audience in terms of, it could be recruiting, it could be in terms of engagement. And then some people, again, with good intentions, will follow that person and engage and rage and get other people to join in, which they love because now they have a whole bunch of followers. It's triggering the algorithm. They're getting tons of attention. And now think about that in terms of how many people are doing that on a daily basis. That why we don't teach kids to block and delete is beyond me. Why do we engage with trolls, some of which are automated trolls, some of which come from troll farms? It just gives them the audience they need. We don't even have to cancel haters in order to just silence the soapbox. Stop giving them a soapbox. And that's what concerns me, because even people like young kids who are trying to react to that, not knowing the danger that it poses if you do react, for example. So not only are you like exponentially increasing the audience and reach and triggering the algorithms, but now that person, that child could be a target of hate. They could be doxxed unknowingly unless we really, really engage in education. Because all of this, when it comes down to it, when you do all of the research, and everybody on this panel knows, it all comes down to white male power for the most part. Obviously, there's exceptions. Obviously, there's women in many of these groups, but it is pretty concentrated in white male power. And so that's how, when you look at white male dominated institutions, you shouldn't be surprised that we see these same things here too. So I want to see us address hate in general, like not just online, but how that has been infused in our state institutions. Because we know here in Canada, and I don't know how many times Canadians respond to me and say, what are you talking about? It's Canada. We're not like that. That's the US. Well, we know from the stats that Canadians on a per capita basis are far more engaged in online fringe groups and hate groups, spreading lies, fears, conspiracy. And the far right love that, because we all know what the far right methodology is, right? So you take a legitimate concern from someone like, I'm worried that I don't get to work because of COVID health mandates. How am I going to take care of my kids? And then you add a whole bunch of lies and conspiracy theories to really stoke the fears. And then the oversimplification that far right activists, I don't even know what you call them, far right fringe groups do, is they present an overly simplified solution to a complex problem with someone in their targeted, like people that they hate, to blame, right? So, it's this woman's fault, it's Black people's fault, it's Indigenous women's fault, it's Jewish people's fault. And so then that starts to answer the fears of people. Someone has the solution because our politicians don't. And so then it just starts unraveling from there. And then people who never thought they'd be part of hate groups are standing side by side, arm in arm with neo-Nazis and other hate groups in Ottawa, thinking that they were going there for COVID mandates. And that's how easily the far right can recruit. And now you have millions of people who would vote for a far right party, like some of those unnamed leaders that we're talking about. And this is all playing out on real time. And they use the same distraction techniques as any other PR company. In fact, despite the statistics that hate groups in general and like the far right extreme groups tend to be less educated, and I know they get really upset by that, the fact of the matter is they're very skilled at recruiting. They're very skilled at stoking people's fears, and the online forum is great. And the media, mainstream media, just plays into that now. They have a lot to do with this. But you combine all of that with groups like Indigenous peoples or women, where there's a significant lack of justice in this country, where there's significantly high rates of violence against Indigenous peoples and women. There's like still ingrained societal racism, systemic racism, there's state neglect, and the gross failure of states like Canada to protect the basic human rights and safety of its own citizens, while it is focused on pipelines, mines, economy, getting a seat on the UN Security Council, whatever you want to call it. That's what's happening. And we're not doing enough to really target the ways that we can address right now. Like, I'm not going to convince any far-right extreme group to stop being haters, right? But there are so many strategies that we can say, hey, listen, Wendy, you know, when you responded to that tweet, here's the implications of it, and here's how you boost their audience and algorithm and everything else. We can be teaching each other that, because I still see people in the media making a story, like literally a whole story out of how some random user 1234 said some terrible misogynistic thing to them. And now that's a story in the media about that, which just gets it like phenomenally more attention. So we need to do a lot about how to prevent people from being doxxed, about online security, about how to support one another, about how to do the opposite of what they far right call cancel culture, and just don't give them the audience. That would be far more effective than any of the kind of like outrage stuff that we do that really just feeds them. And I think that would be very significant in deflating the so-called manosphere, because they need our reactions and fear and hate to do that. They need our connections to do that. They need our advertising to do that. So, I mean, block and delete. Everybody who's listening to this, block and delete and don't respond. Now, if it's the prime minister or a minister saying something hateful, yes, we have to hold them to account publicly. But man, stop empowering user 1234, and we could just change this, even without changing the legislation about online hate. We could be so effective.
Thank you so very much, Pam. And Nadia, I know you have to leave, so I wanted to give you just a chance if there were any of the questions that you wanted to respond to. We will take an extra 10 minutes. So Barbara, you can come back with Pam and address some of the comments and questions that have been posted. But Nadia, any final comments you would like to make before you have to sign off?
A couple of things. Dr. Palmater is always such an amazing experience hearing you speak about these things. But I want to just echo one of the intersections that you mentioned that I think is really important to consider and remember when we're talking about right-wing extremism, and that is our armed forces and law enforcement, and the nexus that we have seen, and it has been well documented, between white supremacist activity and white supremacist beliefs and white supremacist organizing that comes from within or is linked to especially the Canadian Armed Forces. And there are like documented examples of, for example, the leader of the base, I believe it was, and Dr. Perry, correct me if I'm wrong, who actually learned how to use arms while he was enrolled in the Canadian Armed Forces, and actually enrolled in the Canadian Armed Forces for that purpose, and then started this active armed militia that was based in white supremacist beliefs. So that nexus, I think, is really important and often one that we ignore. Turning to our law enforcement agencies as a solution is not so straightforward as it turns out. So I do think it's really important to remember that. And secondly, I just wanted to answer one of the questions that came up in the Q&A, just about like dealing with Islamophobic incidents and how to, I guess, get through it all. And I get asked this question often, and many people that work at NCCM and other organizations that deal with this type of hate get asked this question often. And I'm really sorry, I don't have an answer of what are some healthy ways of nurturing myself and finding ways to do this work without burning out. I really haven't. And if you have any ideas, if folks have thoughts and have experiences of how that has been done effectively in other spaces, I would love to hear it, because I think there are a lot of people that need to think about that more actively.
Thanks so much, Nadia, for joining us. So Barbara, you've heard, we heard your presentation, you've heard from Nadia, Amanda, and Pam. And there are lots of questions that have been posted some of them for you and some more generally. I wondered if there were a couple that you wanted to take in the few minutes that we have left, and then we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'll first of all say thank you to the whole panel. I mean, this was just amazing, and I think highlights the need for more conversations in this space. As someone has suggested already, we don't have nearly enough venues in which to have this kind of discussion. So I think I kind of want to answer a couple of pragmatic questions together, as well as some deeper questions than that, and because it's a real challenge. There's questions about where the data comes from, and do I have enough data? How do we get the data? And that is such a challenge in this space for a number of reasons. Our work is generally based, well, two pieces. We often work with Institute for Strategic Dialogue in the UK, and they do a lot of the online work. So they're monitoring the social media platforms that we've identified and the individuals and groups that we've identified. So they're doing a lot of that, but we do a lot of, we'll interview former and current activists. We'll interview law enforcement and community-based organizations that are monitoring the far right in particular. So the data gathering is a real challenge, and the online pieces in particular, for ethical reasons as researchers, we can't go into, theoretically, we can go into some of the darkest spaces, right? Those encoded chat rooms. But we also know from key informants, that that's really where the darkest and the worst is actually emerging in terms of, even planning and strategizing around how to recruit, or activities, or even planned attacks. We've had a few of those have been thwarted by law enforcement, thankfully. So it really is, it's triangulated from all possible sources of information, but is a really dramatic challenge, I think, to get to the heart of it. And I think there's a couple of questions here around, the demographics and how we understand the shift in the demographics and people that might not otherwise. And I think Pam said this, right? People who might not otherwise have ever thought they'd affiliate with the far right group suddenly find themselves in their midst. And I think this is especially the case with Convoy, where the convoys, really, I think, illuminated this problem. Because we are very active, we're all very active in social media spaces, and we're exposed to these narratives, and we might catch on to one or two and ask more questions about it, or pursue a little bit more information, and that's the hook, right? That's the hook that the poster is looking for, to engage you in conversation. So they're very good at exploiting. I think they're very what's the word I'm looking for? The word is gone. But they are very good at snagging and catching on to particular grievances, particular concerns, issues that many of us might be facing collectively or individually, and exploiting them as a means, wrapping them and weaving them into their own narratives as a means of drawing in broader audiences. And again, COVID was a great example of that. Taking people who were not necessarily anti-vax or challenging the vax, but questioning. And using that uncertainty in a way that opens them up then to broader questions and concerns and issues around, well, if you're questioning that, you're wise to do so, because of course implanted in that serum is a chip that allows the Jews to manipulate you through 5G technology. So it's not quite as quick as that, but it can lead people, as I talked about with the gaming environment, into those darker spaces. So I think that is how people who are otherwise very smart and savvy and perhaps self-reflective find themselves slowly drawn in there. I think one of the other things that was alluded to in one of the questions is people who might otherwise be targeted sort of becoming part. If we look at the leader of the Proud Boys in the US, who was convicted around January 6th events was Latino. And, that's, again, I think that speaks to the fragmentation of the ideologies that, regardless of your race, religion, national origin, all those questions, there's something for everyone within the far right. Again, that opportunism that they are so, so adept at. It allows space for otherwise targeted people to nonetheless fit, and that is to their benefit, because then they can say, we're not racist. Look, our leader is Latino. We're not racist. Look, we have Black members. Again, it's very conscious and purposeful within the groups very often.
I think what I've learned just in one session is we should have allowed more time for everything, including the discussion. We will have a record, both of the presentations as well as the questions. We do have a number of follow-up initiatives that are tied to this, including a project looking specifically at the role of the media. And what's interesting in the discussion, we've heard about how the mainstream media interacts with the online media and can actually fuel and amplify some of the more fringe organizations and views. And really important, I think, to dig in more on that, the importance of naming the problem. And you did such an excellent job of showing all of those interconnections, the idea of and I love the Niemeyer quote. It's sort of part of the banality of evil notion that good people not taking action is what allows this to flourish. And we have to really recognize that our story about Canada is a very flawed story, that we and I'm the first to admit that I'm someone who just did not know, really did not know. I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act last Saturday. I learned about the impact of residential schools less than 3 years ago. I'm the first to admit that my knowledge about the history of these things, which is critically important for understanding the present and looking at it in a global context, is absolutely fundamental. And the awareness building, I thought Pam had some really interesting comments about how we need to stop fueling and amplifying many of these voices. And hopefully tomorrow we'll talk more about some of those strategies. And then, of course, the very important point that both Pam and Nadia stressed, and Amanda to a certain extent, these are problems that are embedded deeply in some of our most important institutions. And I think, I'm not sure, Barbara, that you mentioned it, but part of the reason I was very drawn to your work is because at a time when everyone was defining terrorism in a particular way, you were drawing attention to the nature of the real threat to Canadians. And unfortunately, we have to really look in the mirror and recognize that the enemy is us, and figure out ways to root that out at all levels, and also address the very, very important issues that you raised, Barbara, about youth. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this session. Thank everybody for participating. We look forward to working with you more, Barbara, and your center on some of the go forward actions. And back to you, Juan.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And a very, very big thank you to Barbara for her opening presentation, as well as to all our panelists, Nadia, Amanda, and Pamela, who had to leave earlier. And yes, some very, very interesting, very important messages coming out of that panel, without a doubt, about those complexities and the capillarity of that ecosystem of hate groups in terms of the international, the societal, cultural, and political context, and also how those factors shape those processes of recruitment, of mobilization, and of action of these right-wing extremist groups. And related to that, the complexities of addressing the issue, right? That a lot of what we'll be talking in the panels tomorrow. But also that the way that the space, that the polarization of social and political discourse has opened for the hate speech to grow, but also to connect to those spaces, the connection of those spaces and institutions to the institutions of the state, particularly the coercive arm of the state, the very pervasive impact of all of that. So again, thank you very much for such a wonderful discussion, such a great panel.